Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Shudder to Think Cult Horror and Indie Horror Filmmaking Podcast. I'm your host, John Iceberg, former special education teacher, musician, filmmaker, film producer, cinematographer, all that kind of stuff. I've worked on a bunch of films since 2014. I've shot a lot of music videos. I've worked with all kinds of artists. I've done documentaries, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, and then basically my first film that I did came out in 2022 and hit streaming in fall of 2023, and I learned just so much from it. It was pretty insane. And I wanted to start this filmmaking podcast with a focus on horror filmmaking, because there's just, one, I love horror a lot. I kind of grew up on tons of horror. I wasn't allowed to watch horror. And I learned so much from making my film. There was a lot of things I didn't know. I mean, it was basically the whole thing I would call, like, you don't know what you don't know, which is everything. And there was so many things that I went through, so many pitfalls. I had a lot of help along the way from an awesome crew and cast and a lot of other mentors as well. So I just wanted to start this podcast to kind of open it up to a lot of other people who are interested in indie film and in horror film. I went through a lot of the horror conventions, horror film festivals, horror cons, and talked to a lot of other horror fans out there. And I think everybody, it's clear that we all love these films. We all they have a huge place in our heart. All these characters like Michael Myers and Jason and Freddy and all the like Ghostface and and those are the slashers, of course. And then also we'll fight to the death over David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy, and I actually liked Halloween Ends, so I probably lost like half the audience right there. But it's just there is this legacy to the films that we love, and we grew up with them. There's a language to the films. There's just something so fascinating about horror films and how they just kind of hit on all these different levels of our emotions and our nostalgia, and just have this eternal appeal, I think. And in many ways, I find horror movies are a gateway to filmmaking. A lot of famous actors and famous directors got their start making horror films. You take even in the Friday the 13th, you got Kevin Bacon right there, and then later on, which is always a good, jumping point off for like if you ever play 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. But basically, just to give you kind of a sense of the podcast, was that I wanted to kind of break up some of the myths surrounding filmmaking and bring a lot of people who might be really interested in film but feel really intimidated by it, and maybe just give them some of my experience and then experiences of others who are much more experienced than I am, to talk about things that they've learned, lessons they've learned, and how to survive making your film, because it will run you through the mud, to say the least. So basically, just my background. I got into film in 2014. I live in Champaign, Urbana. I was teaching middle school at the time, and a film came through that summer, and they were looking for interns, and so I interned, and I got into the grip department. I had no idea what a grip did, but I knew there was they had openings for camera department, grip department, and production assistant stuff. And camera, I looked online, and I was like, okay, this seems way too intense for me right now. So I'll try grip department, and it was great. I got onto a film set. The film was called Consumed. It was directed by Daryl Ween, and starred Zoe Lister-Jones, who later on went off to do her own horror film, The Craft Legacy, and that was really cool. And she's really awesome. But yeah, 1 second, let me get some coffee here. But it was just a great experience. I had a great. I was in the grip department. I was an intern there, and so I had some really, like the key grip, the gaffer. A lot of them worked on shows in Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, Chicago PD, and I just learned so much from them. And the DP was great too. And just over the time, over working on that set, I started to see lighting and lights as it it kind of works and as it blends and all the different tools and diffusion that you use for it. And so it really kind of, the whole experience changed my life, And I don't know if you ever been on a film set, but I was in the Army or the National Guard, like kind of when I was younger. And so within the, like any kind of company, as they call them, like in a company, an army or platoon or whatever, there's like a division of labor, like there's a hierarchy and a structure within it. So, like my squad, I was in communications. So I was like a signal guy. So I ran the radios and stuff like that. And we'd haul, like commo wire and all sorts of crazy stuff or whatever all over the place. We had a rat rig, this old truck and the radio in the back and all this kind of stuff. But the thing that like struck me about stepping onto a film set for the first time, because it is very strange if you've never been on a film set, there's language that you got to learn, there's a hierarchy there you have to understand, but it felt so much like being in my company or platoon when I was in the Army. It was kind of wild. So like the first AD or the first assistant director, he was kind of like a drill sergeant, or in my company, he was like the first sergeant. He was getting it done. He was getting everything done, making sure you were where you needed to be, making sure that the show was going on, like as it needed to be during that day so they could make the day. And then I would compare the director to like the CEO of the company. Like you don't want to talk to him necessarily. You don't want to be around him much. But you want to look like you're doing your job when he is around, And so I feel like, he or she, like the director of a film is a lot like a CEO in a company. And then, the gaffers are just, or the grip department, it's like the grunts, of the film set. They're getting it done. They're doing the hard work. It's a lot of hurry up and wait as it was for me when I was in the Army. We'd go in, we'd set up and set our command station up or whatever, and then we'd be off to the races. And the grip department, so the film set kind of breaks down like this. There's a director. You don't want to be around the director much because they are in the hurricane. They are in the center of the storm, along with the DP or the cinematographer or director of photography. And then around them, there's producers, and then you've got production designers, all sorts of people on set. But the first AD, or the first assistant director, they're running the show. And so all the sections of a film set or departments need to work together to make sure they make their day. So when it comes to the kind of hierarchy of the set, you've got your director, you've got your director of photography, you've got your first AD. They're kind of running the show. And under the director of photography, it's broken up into the grip and electric section. And the grips are basically what shape the lighting, and the electrics are the ones who are like placing the lighting. That's oversimplified, and I know, and someone out there is going to yell at me about this later, but whatever. Anyway, and it's you're basically working. So in to go into the camera section, there is like a camera utility person who's like running mags all day and running batteries and whatnot and all sorts of stuff, making sure like the camera batteries are charged. You got and then the boss of them is like the second AC, who's making sure all the media is going right, who's helping with the lens swaps, who's running the slate, who's keeping track of the camera reports and understanding we used a 40 on that versus a 50, or we were at this f-stop, in case you need to go back to do a pickup of a similar setup from like the day before, and remember like the color temp on it, like the aperture setting, how many feet away you were from something. And then second AC also is responsible for placing marks for actors too. So you got to know, like the color of the mark, and that's according to the order on the call sheet of the. We can get so into weeds, and this is crazy. And then you got your first AC, who's responsible for, like calling for the lenses. He's responsible for making sure that focus is sharp on like pulling focus all day long. So like he's the boss of that. And then it goes to the camera operator, who, basically everybody preps the camera for them. They step up and off to the races with however the shot is. And then you have Steadicam and all this stuff. And so it's just fascinating. It's like the whole set is kind of meant to be working efficiently. And there's lots of ways in which it can break down, and a lot of it can come down to, inexperience, egos, stress. again, like being on a film set is probably like the most stressful place I've ever been on in my life. And, I was in the Army, I taught middle school, I had PTSD, all these kinds of things. But, it's a place that I both love and am like equally curiously horrified by most of the time when things don't go right. But yeah, it's such an interesting place. And I think that this producer friend of mine, this guy Brett Hayes, he when I started in film, like with that film, it was produced by a company called Shatterglass Studios and Shatterglass Films out of Champaign, and Brett Hayes was one of the production managers on that, and so he would often share his insights with me. Now he works in Chicago, like he did some stuff for Disney and stuff like that, but he does a lot of shows up there. But he told me a long time ago, he said that a completed film is a miracle, and that your film is hanging by a thread, and it can fall apart at any time, whether it's in the idea phase, the script writing phase, the pre-production, the production, the post. And it's totally true. It's completely a miracle that a film is ever made. And I always say, like, when I go to Walmart, they'll have like like those $5 bins of DVDs and stuff, and I always say, like, that's a $5 bin of miracles that happen. Because it's incredible. It's incredible that a film is made. And especially for indie film, where we're at, where we have so many more strikes against us. We don't have the budgets. We don't have the experience. Everyone's learning. There's so many things that we don't know. And that was very true for my film. I made a film called Final Summer, and it's 2024 now. I think I started it in 2019. So at this point, it's like 5 years since then. And so that's a little bit about my background, and I'll get into making Final Summer over time. That in itself is like hours and hours of me rambling on and simultaneously shaking my fist at the clouds, and then also like going to therapy for how insanely stressful and world changing that was. So yeah, and I gotta tell you, like, every time you step up to make a film, it's like expect to get your butt handed to you every day. It is hard. It is very tough, and not gonna lie about that. But yeah, and so that was kind of also one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was to kind of share like a lot of things that I went through, things I didn't know, all the way from like casting through like the shoot itself, how to schedule your shoot, what it's like to light night exteriors, because we are talking about horror films, right? I mean, horror films during the day, okay, sure, midsummer, okay, yeah, all right, okay, get some ND filters for your camera. I know it's more complicated than that, but then you have night lighting, which is like my friend Rob Stern, who's a cinematographer and producer, and he's shot several films for Shudder, and he talks about how he will highlight or underline when he's going through a script any scenes that have night exteriors, because they will break you. They will break you. They will break your crew. They're very tough. You're shooting all night long. Most people have not had that experience yet. And so, like with my film, it was a relatively very green crew. We went to do overnights. We went to do night force exteriors. We were there by ourselves. It breaks you down, and it definitely did on my film. And so, again, it's going to that part of the emphasis of the podcast is not just to talk about horror films, but also to talk about the grueling nature of shooting a horror film, to kind of prepare you mentally and emotionally and physically for this kind of chaos and hard work, because I lost like at least 15 pounds on my film. We stayed at the camp. We were kind of following in the footsteps of like films like Friday the 13th and Sleepaway Camp, where they went to the camps and they'd stay there the entire time shooting it and became a family. And it was really cool. And looking back, there are days that were just completely insane, but also there are days that are some of my favorite days I've ever had. Because of the family crew bond that emerged from such a stressful situation. And the cool thing, and not to just kind of shoot everything down as like it's going to be horrible and it's going to be hard and it's going to suck and you're going to hate your life, but you will find your family through making a movie. You're going to find your crew that will be with you forever, that is always going to be there. And you're going to hope that you always have a chance to make a movie so you can always continue to work with the same people, you know. I got a chance to go to like ASC Masterclass out in LA, American Society of Cinematographers, which I really recommend. It's a really great experience. And, I got to listen to some pretty big-time DPs like Shelley Johnson, ASC, Caleb Deschanel, who shot like The Natural. He also shot Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, which I would try to bother him about sometimes. But it was cool to hear them talk about their stories of coming up, and a lot of them started in horror films. I was just at NAB, and I ran into Dean Cundy and Roy Wagner, who I got to talk to a few times, and, they started in horror. Dean Cundy shot a movie called Halloween, which is, to me, like one of the most, one of my favorite slasher movies of all time. And we definitely emulated a lot of the look, the color, the sense of violence, in which there was not a lot of gore. I know horror fans flipped out about that, like, where's the gore at, where's the blood? But that was kind of where I was coming from, was I wanted to go back to the classics. So kind of to talk about myself as a horror fan, I have loved horror movies for as long as I could remember. I had a buddy of mine, I was in second grade, this kid Josh, he lived across the street from me in Aurora, Illinois, which was, later on known for Wayne's World, but also other films like Let's Get Harry with Glenn Fry, and that was a movie that was shot in the 80s when I was there in Aurora. But yeah, he had HBO, he had cable, and I remember I went over to his house one time, and he's like, hey, let's watch this movie called Poltergeist. I'm like, all right, cool. And I'd never really seen a movie like that before, and I don't think I was really, like, aware of what was about to happen. Because I was also, like, at the time, like, really into, like, Bozo the Clown was, like, a show in Chicago at the time. I had a Bozo the Clown doll, and sure enough, that scene with the clown doll came up, and I was like, yo, like, this sucks. I mean, it didn't suck. It just scared me so bad. I don't think I slept for 2 weeks. I went home. I took my Bozo the Clown doll, and I, like, locked him in some, like, wooden footlocker that I had, and I didn't realize that there was no keys to it, so then my dad got mad at me for that. But I was, like, scared to death from that movie. But it made such an impression on me, too. And then, even like late night as a kid, I remember my dad would sometimes be flipping through the channels after I went to sleep, and I might get up to go to the bathroom or something. I remember specifically one time walking through the living room. He was watching this thing on TV, and it was one of those scenes where it's like, someone's like in the kitchen, and they hear a little like scurry noise, and the music was like, doo, just, nothing going on, but you knew something was tense. And then all of a sudden, this like little African Zuni doll statue thing like jumps out like and like chases Karen Black across the screen as she's like screaming to death and fighting. And that was a Trilogy of Terror, which scared the absolute crap out of me. And again, was another one that made an effect on me. Then later on, of course, like I remember it was St. Patrick's Day, and I was over at my grandpa's house, I think in like Lockport or Joliet or something in a suburb of Chicago with my cousins, and they were watching Night of the Living Dead, and it was in green, black and white. They had like a green filter over it because it's St. Patrick's Day, and it was on Superstation 66 or something. And I'd never seen it before, and it had a real effect on me. And I remember at a certain point, my cousins, we went outside, we were walking around, and we came back in, and they went in before me, and then they locked me out of the house, and they're like, they're coming to get you, John, they're coming. And I just remember like freaking out. So scared to death of like, the zombies in my head. And I just think that's so fascinating about horror, is that it has this way of staying with you and lingering with you. Like, when you're trying to go to sleep at night and you're a kid and you're worried about the monsters in the closet or under your bed or something. There's something just so inherently, deep to our psyche and to our personalities and our emotions and our psychology. And it's just so fascinating. And so, I think just from then, I remember like going to elementary school, and I wasn't allowed to watch scary movies as a kid. I wasn't allowed to like dress up for Halloween really as like a scary figure. So I found like this old section of books like at my elementary school library, and they're all in like the Universal horror monsters and stuff. And so I would check them out, and I'd read them all the time, and I would take them home and smuggle them under my coat, and I would inevitably find them like on top of my bed, like they were like a porn magazine or something. Like my mom would leave them out there for me, like I'm like in trouble. I'm like, oh man, no. So, and they were just like like these little like books on old Universal horror movies, like like so Wolfman. And I remember particularly one with Lon Chaney. There was a still from a movie, a pretty famous silent film called London After Midnight. And he just looks so creepy and so scary. And this is one of the famous lost films, lost from the sound era of this like Lon Chaney silent film that is, just due to like a lack of film preservation at the time or whatever. It just, there was no remaining copies of the film, I think. And so, but the image itself stayed with me. And then I had cousins, like my cousins who would scare me to death with the green St. Patrick's Day Night of the Living Dead movie. One of them worked at a video store, and it was in the 80s. So, I would hear all the time about like, Jason versus Freddy, who would win in a fight between Jason versus Freddy. And this was long before the actual movie, and just hear them talk about these films and everything. And then just to see the posters of at the video stores, at the movies, like in the newspapers, just watching the trailers on TV, and again, going back to my friend Josh, because I wasn't allowed to see horror films. I remember like we would walk to school in the morning. It was like 5 blocks away from my house in Aurora. And he would tell me about the plot for like Halloween 2, which made zero sense at the time until I watched it later. I'm like, oh, that's what he means by the hot tub or whatever, So it was just really cool to I think just horror's always been there for me. And even like coming across horror sometimes, like late at night on TV, like there might be like a WGN would show like a, Friday the 13th, part 3. And it felt like I shouldn't be watching it. It felt like, oh, this is scary. I got to turn it off because my dad might walk in and see me watching this movie, or my mom might yell at me about it or something. And so I think it just, because it was presented in such a way, it was almost like punk rock to me, like things you shouldn't do, because they're, my family was very religious growing up, very conservative, and so it's like, oh, these are sinful or these are evil and all this kind of stuff. And so I think it had this strangely ironic, subversive appeal to me. So, of course, I would go and make a horror film later on. But yeah, so anyway, that's just a little bit of my background. And then, later on, like got into bands, played in bands a lot, did a lot of touring through like, United States and Canada back in like the early 2000s. We had a music video that we did out in LA, and that got me into kind of seeing my first peek behind the scenes at like what it takes to make a music video, what it is to be a director and a cinematographer, how you can make something pretty cool on almost no money at all whatsoever, because I don't think we had much of a budget for any of that stuff. So yeah, anyway, there's just so many lessons that I learned making my film, because we just didn't have any money. We didn't have a lot of money, but thankfully, we had a Kickstarter that was like, I think we raised $16,000 from that, and then I had a couple family and friend investors in the film that kind of kicked in a little bit more per person, and then the rest of it was really out of my pocket. And that's a whole story I can get into another time. We had some actual investors who were coming in with some money, but it turned out they were trying to like rip us off, take the film, all this stuff. Let me turn this off for a second. And there's a whole thing there that's like kind of an insane thing. Like 4 days before we started our film, like we lost like $50,000. And so we were just trying to figure out how to make it work, And so after the fact, like I went off and I worked a lot of side gigs, and I was trying to pay all the crew and cast back from that. And so it was tough. But basically the main point is that there's so many lessons that you learn when you're making a film. And it's really just the story of like, you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know is everything, and everything is going to kick your butt. And every day there's a problem. Every day there is something to overcome. And so I think you have to look at film And actually, it's funny. My friend Rob and I, we both talk about how like we don't even call it filmmaking anymore. We call it problem solving because every day there's a problem. Someone's late, someone doesn't show, the weather changed, there's a cloud, all of a sudden. Like in Illinois, we have like cloud spotters, like, all right, you can kind of gauge, because you'll start a scene in sun, but then a cloud might drift in. So then you're like, well, if you're worried about continuity, if that's something that is entering into your mind at the indie level, continuity-wise, you get to be like, all right, it's like a 30-second cloud, and then you got a 2-minute, 2 minutes of sun followed by another like a 45-second cloud or something like that, so so there's just all these different kind of things you learn or whatever. But yeah, it's so basically the focus of this podcast is on not only like cult horror films and also horror films in general, from like old school horror to modern horror to my favorite 80s horror. That's probably my favorite of the horror kind of era. To like filmmaking, and everything in between. So all the things that my experiences of like going from like the idea phase to writing your script, using a story clock, learning about story structure, casting, finding like people in your local film community, if there is one, or start one. Like I started a free indie film workshop, and we did that for like 4 years. And pretty much all the crew on my film came out of this free film workshop I did, and that saved my butt. So there's just a lot there you can learn from. And again, I think the thing I love about horror, and I'm jumping around here a little bit, but the thing I love about horror is it's such a gateway into filmmaking. There's a low barrier to start. You don't need... the thing I learned is you don't really need names in your movie. The genre sells itself. There are all sorts of different genres with all different kind of pitfalls to them. I think the hardest ones are definitely comedy or drama. And then you've got like action, and forget it because you don't have any budget. Science fiction, that's another one. But I mean, depending on how you write the film, you could make something really cool. There's some great low budget time travel films that are pretty amazing, that are indie films that kind of came out. And then of course you have horror. And the beauty of horror is that it has probably the best audience out there for any genre. And I'll say that with the caveat is that not only they're awesome and they're probably the best, most supportive, but they are also come with a hell of a lot of expectations, standards, and things that they are expecting to see from your film that if you don't hit on, they will definitely let you know about and be like, your movie sucks. You should go work at McDonald's. I don't know why they always say that. I like McDonald's. I'll go there, get some Big Mac or something sometimes. Whoops. But but they're passionate. And I think I really appreciate that about the horror audience, is that they're passionate about your film. There are 3 miracles in film. The first miracle is to make your film, to actually complete it, get it in the can. The second miracle, which I would say is debatable, is to get distribution. Because it could be a miracle. It could also be a curse, so, from which you have no escape from, and then there's plenty of stories about that. But the final miracle, and this is the hardest miracle at all whatsoever, this is absolutely, I agree, this is the hardest miracle, is to get people to actually watch your film. So it's kind of like in Top Gun when he's talking about the 3 miracles, or Top Gun Maverick when they're going to, do the Star Wars, like the trench run plot device for, Top Gun Maverick. Anyway, so yeah, that is the hardest miracle, is to get people to actually care enough to watch your film. And at that point in time, it becomes their film more so than your film. And you can try and fight them on it sometimes, but I don't recommend it because at the end of the day, they're going to win over anyway. And it's a wonderful thing, I think, is to go through the process of getting your film out there, getting reviews, getting those letterbox knuckleheads, and as I like to refer to them sometimes. But it's just all part of the process, and you have to take the hits. You have to keep getting back out there. I think somewhere I heard it something like 90% of filmmakers only make one film. And then the other 10%, maybe they make another film. Maybe they go on to more. So I think a lot of the guests that I'll try to have on the film, it's going to be a variety of people who have never made a film before, or are making their first film before, or who have made a first film. And some people might have worked on many other films. So like a lot of the guests will be, cinematographers, some amazing stunt people that I've met over time, people who are special effects, makeup supervisors on films, actors, directors, filmmakers, people who do sound design, horror con, a horror film festival, runners, horror podcasters, fellow horror fans too. I think I really want to kind of just be able to showcase a lot of people. And also just people who have, like crowdfunders going on for their indie films. I think the biggest and the best thing that we can do is support each other, because there's so much exploitation out there, and there's so many chances for you to get kind of screwed over through like a lack of awareness, a lack of education, which I think sometimes people are kind of banking on to be able to exploit you. And so I really think that the best way to fight a lot of that exploitation is to build a community. And so many filmmakers that I met through going through the film festivals and horror cons helped me out later on. I'm like, hey, can you read this? Can you check out this contract? Or hey, can you look at this distribution agreement? Or hey, can you, is this normal, like in terms of like pay schedules? Or is this, what's this, like when you're going through like the M&E stuff for your QC for your film, like is this normal, as far as all these dings that we're getting or whatever, like it's just. And then when they reach out to you too, you can be like, yeah, this person is great. Or like, hey, like I saw your short, you should definitely submit it to like Days of the Dead or Horror Hound or all these other places, or check these places out. Or like, Popcorn Frights, they care about their films and their filmmakers, like go to these places. So that's kind of what I want to do, is just help. One of my favorite podcasts was this one called Team Deakins with Roger Deakins and his wife, James Deakins. And I love that podcast so much because it was so interesting to listen to people's experiences in the film industry, making films, and take that to your own kind of education. And so I think obviously we care about this genre a lot. I grew up with Roger Ebert, Gene Siskel, constantly bashing horror films. I worked at some of these film festivals or whatever, where horror is typically like that kind of redheaded, step kid that no one likes and no one takes seriously and no one gives it any credit for anything. But I can't think of a genre that has been more visually striking, that has helped more people get their careers started, that has a more passionate fan base, than horror. It's a place where you can be visionary. I think some films, and I was kind of guilty of this too, is like we think about these films like, oh, like it's a documentary or something, right? Like we're capturing real life. But the thing that's so fun about horror is it's so crazy. Like you can get out there, you can be crazy with your film, you can do all this nutso things, You can, like I just saw Strangers Pray at Night, like last night, and I was like, I freaking love this scene at the end when it's like totally an homage to like Christine, where the truck is on fire and it's slowly like following her behind as she's going to the bridge. And I'm like, I'm sitting there thinking like, this is so ridiculous. Like this dude does not die. You start the film like they're fairly normal, but this guy's like getting, like beat up, hit, cut, all this stuff. Now he's like, his truck's on fire, but he's still driving slowly, and then he gets out at the end. And then, yeah. But it's like, I was looking at the shot, I'm like, yeah, this is amazingly cool looking. Like this is cool as hell. Like the shot is freaking badass, like and so you just have to kind of like just allow it, because it's so great, it's so creative, it's so cool, and it's just and then to pay respects to the legacy of horror, because I think as horror filmmakers we build on films we grew up with and films we love, and so you pay that legacy back. So like, yeah, it was clearly a reference to Christine, but that's wonderful, because John Carpenter gave so much to the genre, and then to follow that right up with one more homage to the ending of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Tobe Hooper's film, which was shot by Daniel Pearl, when she gets into the back of the truck and the guy's like swinging at her. It's like, that's kind of, It's very much Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the end, except not during the early morning, like golden hours, still nighttime. But yeah, I just love that stuff about film. Like I love the Easter eggs about film. I love the cinematography of film. I love the lighting of it. All of that stuff. Like the stakes, and even like going to be in the theater when the characters are driving you nuts because they're doing the horror thing. They're doing the horror choices. I just love it. You're yelling at the screen like, oh my, like I guess I've been on a Strangers kick because I went to see The Strangers, Chapter 1 or whatever, because I like Rennie Harlan. He did Deep Blue Sea. He did, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4. He did Die Hard 2, all this stuff. And Cutthroat Island, which is an insane, pirate movie with, I think, like Matthew Modine. Anyway, I get rambly. But, I'm watching the movie and I'm like yelling at the screen, like, oh my God, like, why are you just go out the door or like pick up the gun, and people have done that and told me about it in my movie. Like, they're like yelling at, like, these people are doing so stupid thing. I'm like, but I think that's just part of the fun of the movie sometimes. It's like, yeah, they could do the thing that you're telling them to do, but then like the movie's over, or whatever, or to, do a deep dive into like stress and how stress will, like you get into the tunnel vision of PTSD or whatever, fight or flight, and so you're not always reacting to these things. And oftentimes we want them to have this almost preternatural, like psychic ability to understand the situation they're in. But I think the beauty of horror, and this was something for me, was like our film was playing in the Philippines, and someone wrote me back on like Facebook on the Final Summer page and like, what a piece of crap. And like, I can't believe like she left like they're so stupid, all the characters are so dumb that like they're da da. And he was like, I can't believe she left a perfectly good like running sheriff's truck. I'm like, yeah, that's true. And he was pretty mad about it, but at the same time, the thing that made me kind of embrace what he was talking about, because you could take it as like, oh, my movie sucks, whatever. But what I really love is the fact that somebody on the other side of the world can go see your film, and whether they like it or not, they are relating to the characters in your film. They're relating to your film, your story, what you're trying to do. They might not like what you're doing, but they're relating to it somehow. They're wanting the character to do something in the scene that they're not able to do, whatever. And sometimes I think we interpret that as like, well, this movie sucks or whatever. But there's so many, but the ability to have someone relate to your film is probably one of the best things you can do as a filmmaker. I mean, it's probably the only thing you hope to do when you're making a film is get people to relate to what you're doing. Anyway, I rambled a lot, so I'll get that. I promise that the guest versions will not be as rambly. Someone else can ramble for a change, so it'll be good. But yeah, I've got some people coming up who have shot movies for Shudder. Who one of them was like a top 10 like New York Times horror film of the last year, and lots of great friends, upcoming filmmakers. Hope to get a couple legendary horror cinematographers on the show too. I had, I'll tell you about some more experiences I had as I was getting into the film and reaching out to certain people who were really helpful. And so, yeah, I'd love to just continue that conversation. So anyway, I just want to say thank you guys for checking out the first podcast. I know I was rambly. I'll try to have a little bit more, it's like the first time. It's, you're going to make it better later on. Anyway, who cares? But yeah, thanks again, and keep it here, and we will see you guys later. Thanks again.